The agenda this week debated the state of speech in our social media-driven era and talked to hockey great Ken Dryden about head trauma and the future of Canada's game. Derek Boogaard, Wade Belak, Rick Rippon, Bob Probert. You got not a long list, but you have a list of players who are dying way too young. Why does and the NHL actually always sees these as sort of, well, that's a one-off. That list of one-offs is getting awfully long, isn't it?
It's a long list, and what is a much longer list are the less dramatic examples of where people don't die, but they live very diminished lives. I mean, that's the part that we get into this debate about CTE, and it seems as if it's CTE or not, and that's the question. No, it's not. I mean, CTE is the worst example of it, and that you discover only in postmortems. But it's you know, what is it like to essentially have the symptoms of an 85-year-old when you're 35 years old, when your memory is lousy, when all of your life you've been in completely pressure-filled instances, and then in a non-pressure-filled instance, you feel great anxiety. When it's depression, when you're able to when you're not able to put kind of rudimentary pieces together to solve problems, you know, that is not a very nice life. You know, and whether Steve had died or not at age 35, those were the symptoms that he was feeling the last couple of years of his life. And he had, you know, all of this money that he had earned. He was a smart guy, lots of interests, otherwise would have had, you know, 50 years ahead of him of an incredibly interesting life, except he didn't have the capacity to live the kind of life that would have been ahead of him. That is by far the greater problem to me than the drama of some players who have died.
We should actually take a moment here to explain the three most terrifying letters to most professional athletes today. CTE. What is that, Ken? Well,
it is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Essentially what it is that it's called tau, but it gets in the way of the kind of communications that happen inside of our brain, when, you know, that connect the different pieces. Well, if those pieces are not connected by the stimuli, then we just don't function very well.
And Steve had it.
And Steve had it.
In spades?
I don't know. I mean, it was just, as far as I know, you know, it was just he had CTE.
You don't tell us in the book how he died. Do you know how he died?
I know the aspects of how he died, but I don't know what what the coroner would say finally in the end of it. To me, you know, his story was about the effects on his brain and what his life was like, you know, at the end, and that to me was the story. I spent very little time on writing, you know, the last couple of days of his life.
There is no doubt in your mind that the multiple blows to the head that he took over the course of his 12 years in the NHL resulted in his developing CTE, right?
That's right.
There is considerable doubt among official NHL-dom, particularly the Commissioner Gary Bettman. Why do you believe that doubt exists in their minds?
Because I think it's the doubt that you generate when you are a lawyer and when you are facing lawsuits. I mean, that a lawyer facing a case like this would say, you know, it could happen at any time in his life. It could have happened when he fell downstairs when he was 2 years old. It could have happened in a Pee-wee game. It could have happened at any moment. That what the lawyer would say is that you've got no case because you've got no way to establish cause. You know, that yeah, sure, that he suffered a lot of blows when he was playing, a lot more blows than he would have suffered doing anything else, but you've got a lot of dots, and you're not able to connect those dots. And if you can't connect those dots, then you can't connect me, the NHL, to those dots. So you've got no case.
We all know that discourse has changed a lot over the past year. There is just stuff you cannot talk about anymore. And we want to find out how that's happened. Robin, how has discourse changed over the past year?
I think what we are seeing a lot of is the erosion of that mushy middle ground. Those gray areas seem to be kind of dissipating away a little bit as we carve out our sides here and there. It's hard to explain sort of how that happened. I think part of it has to do with the way that we consume news. We have these little filter bubbles around ourselves. We surround ourselves with people in our personal life and on social media who kind of confirm our pre-existing beliefs. It feels good to put a lukewarm take on Twitter and have 50 people like it. But we're not seeing those dissenting opinions, I think, the way we might have exposed ourselves to in years past.
Is part of the reason for that, Jen, that we can't dissent civilly anymore? We've got to beat out, we beat each other's brains in on social media when we see something we don't like. Is that part of it?
Yeah, but I think that this trend predates social media. I mean, The Economist actually had a fascinating read a couple of weeks ago that showed some very interesting social research that found that tracked the Republicans and Democrats and sort of how their views diverged and converged over time. And I mean, they tracked this over the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and up until the 2000s. And they found that, 60s, 70s, 80s, there was actually a pretty big overlap. If you think of it like a Venn diagram, those two groups were not so far apart. I mean, you definitely had the fringes, but there was still some agreement of position on a lot of issues. And over the decades, as the 90s start to come into play, as talk radio becomes more of an issue, as cable TV becomes more of an issue, these two groups just went further and further and further apart. And now there's almost no overlap, particularly in the US, between not only what a Democrat and a Republican believes, but even what they hear. I mean, it's not even that we're disagreeing about the same issues, we're not even talking about the same issues anymore.
If you think about, if I could say,
sure.
Yeah, if you think about the idea of discourse generally, traditionally that's meant a conversation. These days when you talk about discourse, it's more an argument. And it's the sort of argument where you have angry people on either side yelling at each other and also yelling past each other, not listening to one another. And it's for exactly the reasons that I think you pointed out, both of you have pointed out, that there's this polarization of the facts that now people are getting in. And so it's very easy to retreat into our own kind of enclaves and only listen to people who have the same views as we do.
Except that we as Canadians love to think that we're morally superior to Americans who just bathe in their cable TV bile and love very much the way you just described things. Is it that way here too, in Canada?
Well, sorry.
Go ahead, Vic.
I think there's something to that. I don't think that there's necessarily the tenor and frustration of the conversation here in Canada, but I do think people do sort of self-select into media environments that reflect their particular biases or their particular needs. Canadians are not any more exempt from watching CNN than Americans are, but we match CNN with whatever particular Canadian local channel also reflects those choices. But I think we're not exempt from many of the things that Americans are dealing with, which is that now there's an expansion of who has access to the discourse. I think we've always thought of it as sort of one great conversation that all of society got to participate in. But it's actually, there's been a dominant discourse and sets of people who got to define what that was, and people who are outside of that who didn't get to participate. And now what we're seeing is more people who've been outside of the traditional dominant discourse who are contributing, and they are getting louder, and they're getting much more insistent on ensuring that their viewpoint is represented. Susan. And I think that's a good thing. That's one of the good things that's going on, is that there are no longer these very small groups of elites who get to put their opinions out there, but that everybody can express them. I think there's a couple of difficulties, though. One of them is that unless you express them in extreme terms, you're likely not to get noticed. And that's certainly true for a lot of media who are trying to figure out how to, print media perhaps as well, how to continue to have the influence they want to be having, is that you have to really express things in these really extreme terms to get, I think, the clicks. Let's be clear. And I think that one of the things that's interesting to me is what happens when we make the distinction between polarization and conflict. What's good about what's happening now is that it creates conflict. There's nothing wrong with conflict.
Conflict actually gets you to the point where you're actually going to be discussing what you're supposed to be discussing, and that's a good thing. But polarization means that you're not going to be having the conversation at all, and I think that's what has changed now. Conflict, you know, the extremeness of it may help you get to the point, but polarization will not allow the dialogue to happen.
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay, so here's what's good and what's bad. Is that it's really, really good that social media and I guess the lowering of the standard for publishing is giving access to people who are non-traditional people to have their voices heard and have their opinions heard. That's all the really, really good side of all of this. The bad side is that I think that if you're looking for a historical analog to where we're going right now, you really have to go to the 18th century and the widespread adoption of the printing press and, you know, the emergence of pamphleteers and propagandists into the public square, and to find the equivalent degree of nastiness, lies, misinformation, conspiracy theory, and that's really where I'm getting concerned. It's this polarization, but it's a polarization combined with just disregard for some basic standards of truth-telling and backing up your position, your opinions with any kind of factual position, with never having to check your opinions against people who disagree with you. And that's where you get sort of the breakdown of the polity. And that's where you get what I fear, which is it's not just the conflict, which is a good thing, but it's a breakdown of social discourse that can lead to fracturing and, at its most extreme end, violence.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, December 22nd, 2017. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety at tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream on our Periscope page. That's periscope.tv/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.